Barack Obama stared directly into the eyes of J.D. Vance and delivered a chilling masterclass in political condescension, explicitly warning the junior senator that he had no right to lecture a veteran community organizer about grassroots realities, especially considering his own organizing days on the south side of Chicago began long before the man from Ohio had even learned to read the alphabet. The audience in the gallery predictably ate out of the palm of his hand, leaping to their feet as that specific soundbite hit 60,000 shares across social platforms in a mere 4 minutes. He was still playing the hits, wielding that untouchable aura, manipulating his vocal rhythm and subtly tilting his microphone down a fraction of an inch right after his final syllable, as if the hardware itself were somehow unworthy of carrying his cadence. It is an objective truth of modern theater that nobody on this earth delivers a scripted sentence quite like him. Yet the fascinating dynamic was that his opponent was not even paying attention to the performance. Instead, the challenger kept his eyes fixed on the screen of his laptop, harboring a single, undeniable metric that 7 million viewers would ultimately remember far longer than any poetic phrase ever uttered on that stage. This was not some whispered backroom scandal or a speculative rumor. It was a cold, hard integer sitting right there in the public record, completely verifiable by any citizen willing to look. When the senator finally read that figure aloud, he did not try to match the theatrical polish of his adversary. He simply let his unvarnished, flat Ohio dialect take over, speaking with the grounded tone of a man who grew up watching his mother battle severe chemical dependency, now reading a final invoice to the wealthiest and most influential man in the room. For perhaps the very first time in his meticulously curated public career, the former executive did not have a pre-written monologue capable of bailing him out, simply because a politician cannot speechify away a ledger. You cannot throw slogans of hope and change at a balance sheet, and this particular balance sheet was intrinsically tied to a specific geographical address. It belonged to a neighborhood on the south side, the exact territory where he built his political mythology, where he had just finished constructing an architectural monument so costly that the very citizens he swore to protect were being systematically priced out of their own homes. The evening had been marketed to the public as a neutral, high-minded dialogue regarding civic duty and historical legacy, structured as a town hall moderated by an impartial party, ostensibly focused on the philosophical nature of presidential libraries. However, timing in politics is never a coincidence, and this facility had officially opened its doors just 4 weeks prior. He had entered the venue carrying the specific, undeniable gravity of an individual who once commanded the most powerful office on the globe and who has never truly relinquished his grip on the spotlight. Sitting down, crossing his legs, and adjusting his lapel mic, he moved with the effortless muscle memory of an operative who had survived 10,000 interviews and no longer needed to consciously think about his stage presence. This was supposed to be a home game, set in his city, surrounded by his narrative, operating within the shadow of his crowning achievement. Opposite him, the visual contrast was stark and entirely deliberate. The most celebrated orator in modern history was going head-to-head with an opponent armed with nothing but a ThinkPad and an open spreadsheet. It was a contemporary retelling of David and Goliath, except this time the underdog had replaced the traditional slingshot with an accounting tool. The debate commenced with a 4-minute wave of pure eloquence, painting vivid pictures of the local organizers who shaped his worldview and the future generations who would walk through the newly built corridors to see their own reflections etched into the American narrative. His vocal delivery operated like a well-tuned instrument, rising and falling in perfect harmony, washing over the venue and making attendees temporarily forget they were witnessing a calculated political skirmish, tricking them into feeling like participants in a historic milestone. By the time he deployed the phrase, "this community," for the third time and referenced our story twice, the crowd reacted as though they were attending a religious revival rather than a civic discussion. Then came the pivot, characterized by a paternal, almost condescending tilt of the head, acknowledging his rival's Appalachian roots while asserting his own lifelong dedication to knocking on doors and learning the true definition of struggle directly from the working class. He suggested that authentic leadership is forged on the streets, not extracted from a lucrative publishing deal. The room broke into a frenzy, offering not just standard applause, but a full-blown coronation, thrilled to watch their champion execute his signature playbook with flawless precision. Backstage, the communications staff watched their desired narrative materialize perfectly, believing the hierarchy had been reestablished and the upstart challenger had been effectively put in his place. The silence on the stage lasted exactly 5 seconds. Letting the glow of his screen illuminate his face, the junior senator ignored the jab about his memoir, bypassed the reference to his hometown, and completely disregarded the lecture on grassroots activism. He simply looked up and asked the former commander-in-chief to state his current residential address. Those few basic words brought an immediate and awkward halt to the coronation. The atmosphere grew incredibly tense because the honest answer did not point back to the gritty streets of the South Side. It pointed directly to Martha's Vineyard, specifically to an $11.75 million coastal estate situated on an exclusive island where the median property value hovers around $1.3 million. On that particular island, the year-round population barely reaches 15,000 residents, and a citizen is far more likely to encounter a luxury real estate broker than a community organizer. A tight, professional smile crept across the elder statesman's face, projecting a quiet acknowledgement of the rhetorical trap being set, as he deflected the inquiry by stating he resides wherever his family resides, arguing that the location of his public service matters far more than where he happens to sleep. That subtle deflection was the exact opening the challenger needed to pivot the debate squarely onto the financial reality of that supposed public service. Clicking open a new browser tab, he began laying out the cold mechanics of the legacy project that had opened on the 19th of June, 2026, sprawling across 19.3 acres of Jackson Park. What was initially projected to require a budget of $300 million had inexplicably swelled to a final price tag of $850 million, cementing its status as the priciest presidential facility ever constructed. He let that figure hang in the silent air. Dropping an $850 million development into a zip code where the median household income barely scratches $35,000, and where 1 in 4 locals remains trapped beneath the poverty threshold, is an act that carries profound consequences. That kind of capital registers very differently in a working-class district than it would at an elite donor retreat. It sits there like an immovable monolith, casting a long, unignorable shadow over the surrounding blocks. The foundation had long maintained a strict, highly publicized talking point, asserting that the project relied entirely on private capital without draining a single cent of taxpayer resources, a corporate narrative the senator was eager to dissect on live television. Opening another tab, he revealed that state and municipal governments had quietly funneled over $350 million into infrastructure, specifically tailored to support the new compound, covering a vast array of transit links, road overpasses, and utility relocations. While these expenditures sit squarely in the public record, no single governmental agency, neither at the state nor the local level, had ever bothered to publish a consolidated receipt for the taxpayers. He posed a sharp, logical question that cut through the spin. If a private citizen builds a mansion but forces the local municipality to construct a taxpayer-funded bridge and sewer system just to access it, can that property truly be classified as privately funded? To ground this abstract arithmetic in undeniable human reality, he introduced the story of Denise Williams, a retired healthcare worker who had spent 4 decades living in Woodlawn, the district sharing a direct border with a new compound. After dedicating 36 years to the University Medical Center and successfully raising a family in that neighborhood, she watched helplessly as her monthly rent surged from $1,200 in 2019 to $1,850 today, representing a staggering 54% spike in her cost of living. The financial squeeze became so unbearable that it forced her daughter and granddaughter to pack up their lives and abandon the neighborhood entirely just last year. Decades ago, a young, idealistic organizer walked those exact streets, knocking on doors identical to hers, promising the working-class residents that he would fight tooth and nail for their economic futures. Now, that same man had dropped an $850 million anchor right on their doorstep, driving the local cost of living so high that his former constituents were being systematically erased from the map. Sensing the narrative slipping away, the elder statesman leaned forward, adopting the familiar authoritative posture that usually precedes a wave of soaring inspiration. He argued vehemently that the facility serves as a vital economic engine designed to generate employment, spur regional tourism, and offer unprecedented educational avenues for marginalized youth who had historically been ignored. The junior senator did not raise his voice or interrupt. He simply pointed out that a 54% rent hike is a deeply flawed metric for community investment. The poetic defense hit a brick wall, proving that while rhetorical momentum can carry a speaker for a few seconds after a collision, the trajectory of the conversation had irreversibly shifted. Forcing an orator of this caliber to abandon a rhythmic monologue mid-sentence is a political anomaly that borders on the impossible, yet the cold reality of a retired nurse's monthly bills accomplished exactly that, proving once and for all that ledgers are entirely immune to charm. Moving methodically to his next point, the challenger bypassed campaign finance filings and dug straight into the weeds of municipal land use. He noted that the sprawling compound occupies 19.3 acres of public parkland, a historic civic space maintained by taxpayer funds and originally conceptualized in the late 19th century. The foundation managed to secure a 9-year lease on this prime urban real estate for the grand total of $10. He paused deliberately to let the sheer absurdity of the transaction settle in the minds of the viewers a century of control over public land handed over without a single competitive bid or public auction, greenlit by the city council for the cost of a deli sandwich. Comparable real estate transactions indicate the true market value of that specific parcel hovers somewhere between $20 million and $50 million. By paying merely $10, tens of millions in public equity were essentially stripped from the local taxpayers and transferred to a privately managed foundation. This arrangement does not function as a philanthropic donation. It operates as a corporate subsidy, funded squarely on the backs of citizens who are simultaneously facing the threat of eviction. Bringing the focus back to the retired nurse, he highlighted the bitter irony that her property taxes had subsidized the upkeep of that very park for 40 years, only for the municipal government to surrender it to a private entity for a $10 bill. To put it as plainly as possible, she pays more for a monthly transit pass than the billionaire-backed foundation paid to monopolize a century of public green space. The former president attempted to counter with a statistical defense, citing a university projection, claiming the facility would inject $3.1 billion of economic activity into the region over the coming decade, framing the surrounding infrastructure work as a desperately needed urban revival. Yet the counter-argument was surgically precise, questioning not the sheer size of the financial windfall, but the actual identity of the beneficiaries. Generating $3.1 billion in a rapidly gentrifying district rarely enriches the long-term residents. Instead, it pads the pockets of the affluent newcomers who inevitably replace them. Having grown up in a forgotten Rust Belt environment where economic revitalization usually meant shiny new storefronts for out-of-towners, while the original locals watched helplessly from the sidelines, the challenger intimately understood the vast gulf between gross economic activity and actual community benefit. He knew that building a luxury mall in a working-class zip code means absolutely nothing if the current residents cannot afford to shop there. The former president opted not to engage with the brutal economics of displacement, executing a highly polished pivot toward youth mentorship and job readiness programs. While this specific tactic had successfully navigated him through over a decade of hostile press briefings, tonight the sleight of hand was painfully obvious, exposed to an audience that was finally paying close attention to the mechanics of the illusion. The next revelation fundamentally altered the nature of the debate, shifting the lens from a philosophical discussion about historical legacy directly into a courtroom-style interrogation regarding legal accountability. The junior senator pointed out a glaring technicality that the media had largely ignored. Unlike every other comparable institution managed by the National Archives, this new compound operates entirely outside the federal system. Back in 2017, the foundation quietly opted out of federal oversight to strategically bypass a strict mandate requiring a permanent endowment equal to 60% of the construction budget. By sidestepping this rule, they avoided tying up $510 million in reserve funds, while simultaneously retaining absolute unchecked authority over the architecture and mission. Consequently, the actual classified records of the administration are stored in a separate government warehouse outside city limits, meaning this sprawling campus contains a basketball court, a rooftop playground, a winter recreation hill, and corporate offices, but lacks the very historical archives it is named after. It operates as a privately governed headquarters resting on public soil, shielded by $350 million in civic infrastructure improvements, sitting in a neighborhood where housing costs have skyrocketed. Closing that browser window, he questioned the legal legitimacy of their tax-exempt status, which hinges entirely on maintaining a strict educational mandate. If the organization intentionally avoided federal oversight to dodge a $500 million endowment penalty and zero primary historical documents are housed on site, one has to wonder if the educational mission is genuine or just a convenient legal shield utilized to build a monolithic vanity project. Reading the tax code with the chilling precision of a seasoned attorney, he openly challenged whether the law actually permits sledding hills and vegetable gardens to qualify as scholarly research facilities. Dropping his voice to a lower register devoid of theatrics but heavy with conviction, the junior senator opened his final piece of evidence, channeling the deep-seated frustration of neglected working-class towns everywhere. He revealed that earlier in 2025, a minority-owned construction firm hired for the project filed a $40 million lawsuit. The litigation alleged that the management firm actively sabotaged the foundation's own diversity and inclusion mandates, aggressively penalizing minority contractors for minor infractions while conveniently ignoring identical mistakes made by their non-minority counterparts. It is a bitter, inescapable irony that an organization publicly dedicated to transforming racial equity in the construction sector is currently facing severe legal action from the very workers it promised to uplift. $850 million was spent in a historically marginalized neighborhood, yet the contractors building it are crying foul over systemic bias. Closing his machine for the first time all evening, the challenger leveled a final, devastating indictment, acknowledging that while a young Harvard graduate may have genuinely cared when he knocked on local doors in 1985, that same man did not sign off on a $10 land grab. That early idealist did not artificially inflate a budget to $850 million while local wages stagnated, nor did he engineer a corporate loophole to avoid a $510 million federal endowment requirement. And he certainly would not have tolerated discrimination on a job site bearing his name. He concluded that the grassroots organizer of the past and the corporate executive of the present are two entirely different entities, a harsh reality painfully understood by the retired nurse who is now being forced out of her home. Taking the floor one last time, the elder statesman delivered a response that defied the gravity of the accusations, launching into an objectively magnificent speech. It was a masterclass in rhetorical architecture, weaving the moral cadence of civil rights leaders with the structural brilliance of historical statesmanship, making listeners feel that society was fundamentally better than its flaws suggested. He spent 3 minutes romanticizing the weight of history, the long arc of justice, and the enduring power of hope, executing every pause and vocal inflection with the polished perfection of a man who has spent 4 decades mastering the art of persuasion. Yet, when he finished, the expected roar of approval never materialized. The ensuing silence was not born of shock, but of a quiet, uncomfortable realization among the attendees the audience had been fed, a steady diet of indisputable numbers, and poetry could no longer satisfy their hunger for accountability. The majestic monologue hovered miles above the reality of the street, beautiful to observe but entirely disconnected from the financial devastation occurring below. This was the exact moment the most talented speaker in modern politics delivered his finest performance, only to find the crowd refusing to follow his lead. They had learned a harsh lesson that evening. Lyrical promises and bank statements belonged to two entirely different realities, and tonight the math was undeniable. The challenger offered no further remarks, casually sipping his water with the calm demeanor of an auditor who had just finished balancing a disastrous ledger. Watching from the shadows in the wings, the communications director stared at a pre-drafted fundraising email on his phone, its subject line begging for urgent financial support. He quietly saved it to his drafts, acutely aware that asking supporters for cash while the nation debated the outrageous price tag of his boss legacy project would invite an unmitigated public relations disaster. Ironically, the footage that dominated the internet the following morning was not a clip of the challenger's ruthless arithmetic, but rather the former president's 3-minute masterpiece. It racked up 29 million views precisely because of the agonizing silence that followed it. Exposing a room that could no longer unhear the truth, the media swiftly branded it the speech that failed, a narrative the campaign team proved entirely powerless to suppress despite their best efforts. A secondary clip highlighting the $10 land lease pulled 14 million views, circulating aggressively among urban planners and municipal watchdogs who had never witnessed such a blatantly lopsided real estate transfer survive the scrutiny of live television. Within days, local aldermen were publicly demanding a full investigation into the transaction. However, the most culturally resonant piece of footage centered entirely on the retired nurse's bus pass. Amassing 12 million views, it transcended partisan politics and became a simple math lesson illustrating the grotesque absurdity that a working-class senior citizen pays more for a month of public transit than a billionaire-backed foundation paid for a century of prime parkland. The political fallout was swift and procedural, moving rapidly from viral outrage to concrete institutional action. A bipartisan coalition of senators formally petitioned the Government Accountability Office to execute a comprehensive audit of all civic funds tied to the compound's infrastructure. Simultaneously, a watchdog group filed a formal grievance with the Internal Revenue Service, questioning whether a campus devoid of presidential archives and heavily reliant on recreational amenities genuinely qualifies for educational tax exemptions. At the municipal level, city leaders introduced legislation demanding a retrospective review of the land lease, effectively admitting on the record that the initial agreement was a catastrophic failure of public trust. Meanwhile, the $40 million discrimination lawsuit advanced to the discovery phase, forcing the foundation to surrender internal communications regarding their minority hiring practices, a legal progression that required no political spin to be profoundly damaging to their brand. By the third week, independent data requested from the Housing Authority confirmed the grim reality on the ground rental rates in the surrounding districts had surged by nearly 48%, completely dwarfing the citywide averages. While correlation is not strictly causation, the statistical trend perfectly mirrored the warning delivered on that debate stage, painting a clear and undeniable picture of urban displacement masquerading as civic development. The former president remained personally silent, allowing his organization to release a sterile corporate statement highlighting foot traffic and youth engagement metrics. It was a classic institutional defense, boasting about numerical outputs like ribbon cuttings while intentionally ignoring the devastating human outcomes. That massive gulf between corporate press releases and working class survival is exactly what the junior senator exposed under the harsh studio lights. The soaring rhetoric will always retain its aesthetic beauty, but aesthetic beauty is not a substitute for the truth. And on that night in Chicago, an unpolished politician armed with a laptop proved that the difference between a speech and reality can be measured in 54% rent hikes and a $10 bill.